Hey there, Alex Kidman here, and this is the Oppo A5X, a very low-cost Oppo phone. Here in Australia, it'll cost you just $219, and every single time I get a budget phone like this in for review, I have to think in terms of compromises, because building to a budget means making compromises somewhere. You can't have it all, because if you have it all, it costs you an awful lot of money, and $219, while not the cheapest phone out there, is not an awful lot of money. So where has Oppo saved money? Where's it spent it? And what does that mean for the overall value proposition of this phone? Well, let's get into it first of all with the design. And look, honestly, the design of the Oppo A5X shows rather clearly one of the areas where Oppo has kept matters on the more affordable side. It's built around a 6.77-inch 90Hz capable display, which is a fine size, but it's only got a resolution of 1604 by 720, which limits it to being just 720p. Now, that's a pretty common play in the budget space right now, though shopping around can sometimes find 1080p capable phones at this kind of price. The other low-cost aspect of the A5X's design is that it's a remarkably plain phone. Here in Australia, Oppo offers it in laser white or midnight blue finishes. It's the latter that I've reviewed. And look, I'm notably a fan of blue as a phone colour, but this is a darker blue and it often appears more black or dark grey, as you can see here, than blue. It appears that Oppo does also produce a slight variant of the A5X in a tranquil lake green colour as well, though that's a phone with quite a few internal differences compared to the model I've tested, so be careful when shopping online to ensure that you get the phone you're planning to buy. The Australian models only come in the two colours. Controls for the Oppo A5X all sit on the right-hand side, with volume above a combination fingerprint reader and Android Assistant power button, while at the base you'll find USB-C for power and data, next to a classic 3.5mm headphone jack if wired headphones are your style. The left-hand side houses a dual nano SIM microSD card slot, and that's your lot. Well, nearly. There's one single design area where the Oppo A5X is actually exceptional, and it's in the surprising area of water resistance. So many budget phones simply mumble something about being water repellent, which, as I explained in my video about water resistance, really doesn't mean much of anything. But the Oppo A5X is rated at IP65. That won't protect it against your adventures in the depths of the sea, but it's a lot more in terms of tested endurance than you see from many competing handsets at this kind of price. On the camera front, Oppo has long prided itself as being a camera phone company, but again, when you're building to a lower cost, this is an area where compromises are often made, and that's absolutely true for the Oppo A5X, which features a simple 32-megapixel wide sensor at the rear and a 5-megapixel front-facing camera, which is a very simple recipe, especially given many competitors, even in this price space, will spring for a 50-megapixel sensor, although megapixels are not the be-all and end-all of phone quality. And look, we have thankfully gotten past the point where budget smartphones offer terrible cameras. I mean, some feature phones still offer terrible cameras, but in the smartphone space, generally speaking, in good conditions, you can still get reasonable sort of photos. Obviously, low light and fast motion is kind of out of the picture here. And honestly, yeah, you'll still need plenty of patience and good light to get much that's all that exciting out of the Oppo A5X. There is, of course, no optical zoom on a single wide lens, and cropping in with digital zoom at up to 10 times quickly falls apart. Even moderate lengths are not great on this phone. Even on the selfie front, look, it does an okay job, but it's not spectacular. Does not particularly do a great cutout job around my lack of hair. Again, this all kind of works within this price point, although it is a little bit surprising to see from such a camera-centric company as Oppo. On the performance side, the Oppo A5X is built around a Qualcomm Snapdragon 6S 4G Gen 1 processor with, for the Australian model as tested, just 4GB of RAM and 128GB of onboard storage. It appears that some international variants may bump that up to either 6GB or 8GB of RAM, but 4GB's all we get here. Now, phones with 4GB of RAM in 2025 tend to be slow because that level of RAM often becomes the true bottleneck of performance. So how does the Oppo A5X compare? Well, let's start with Geekbench 6, comparing it against broadly similarly priced handsets at the time of producing this review. Now obviously prices vary over time, but at the point where this video is being shot, the above phones sit between price ranges of around $180 to around $299. So we're talking phones that are broadly similar in price. The Oppo A5X is outdone here rather obviously by the Motorola Moto G05 and the Samsung Galaxy A05s, but the reality at these levels of performance is that they're all on the slower side ultimately. The Oppo A5X does fare a little better if we look at GPU performance by way of 3D Mark Slingshot Extreme, but the practical thing here is at this price point you don't really get fast phones. I mean, you'd never get a fast phone, but you don't even get middle range phones in terms of speed. That's not one of the compromises that phone manufacturers can build around, and the A5X does about what I'd expect. I mean, forget multitasking on this thing. Be ready for some lag, whether you're launching the camera, opening a web page, or running most standard Android apps. And this, again, isn't a huge surprise at this price point, although I do feel it's a little bit exacerbated by the low level of RAM on the A5X. Like everything Oppo, you're faced with ColorOS, which is an acquired taste for many, overlaid on top of Android 15, but this is one area where Oppo's doing something rather special for such a low-cost phone. Most budget phones only see maybe a single OS upgrade, if that, but Oppo is reportedly providing 3 OS upgrades and 6 years of security updates for the A5X, which is truly exceptional for a phone at this kind of price. It's simply a new benchmark for what to expect out of low-cost phones and how long they might last and be supported for, and I, for one, I've got to tip my cap to Oppo in this respect. It's great to see it's a huge value bet on this phone's future. One feature you don't get, however, on the Oppo A5X is any level of 5G support. This is a 4G phone, plain and simple. And look, the reality here is there's little risk of Australia's telcos decommissioning 4G within this phone's likely lifespan, and certainly not within the scope of that promise of Android OS and security updates. And Australia's 4G networks aren't the fastest critters out there, they're constantly busy too. Testing with the Oppo A5X in Sydney on the Telstra network, I typically hit speeds of between 25 to 50 meg down. The 4G LTE specification certainly can fly faster than that, but congestion plays its role there too. The Oppo A5X's other superpower hides within its frame, with an impressive 6,000 mAh battery to keep it ticking along. And look, it's not the first 6,000 mAh phone I've tested, but typically that kind of power has either been the province of gaming phones or phones that sold very specifically on their battery prowess. The Oppo A5X just has a big battery, and that can be a big plus as long as it's capable of reasonable battery power management. And as is always the case, how you use a phone has a huge impact on how long its battery lasts day by day. I've got a whole video about how I test mobile phone batteries, which you can watch at your leisure. But as always, my first stop is my YouTube 3-hour battery test to get a picture of comparable performance against other phones. And I'm using that same set of phones I used for the CPU and GPU comparisons here because they're all in about the same price point. So how did the Oppo A5X fare here? And the answer here is not just very well, but exceptionally well. Really, really top-notch battery life there. Easy all-day battery life for most people, with the obvious caveat being that the A5X is only pushing out its pixels to a 720p display, and that has less of a power draw. But then again, the only phone in this comparable group that has a 1080p display is the Samsung one. The Motorola has a similar 720p screen, and the HMD screen is actually lower quality than that. And this does carry through to day-to-day performance. Again, though, with the observation that the slower nature of the A5X does mean you're less likely to stress it in a hardcore way when it runs in the leisurely fashion that it does. On the charging front, there's no wireless charging. Of course, it's a $219 phone, don't be ridiculous, but it does support Oppo's own proprietary SuperVOOC charging standard at up to 45 watts, which is very rapid for a phone in this price bracket, but you'd basically need to have an existing SuperVOOC charger on hand to top it up that way because there's none in the box, or at least not for the Australian model. It's USB-C though, so pretty much any USB-C charger will be able to top it up. So, should you buy the Oppo A5X? Well, when you're buying in the budget space, your first priority is always cost. If you simply can't afford a specific phone, it doesn't really matter if it's $250 or $2,500 after all. Your second priority can vary, depending on how you actually want to use a phone, and this is where you have to weigh up which compromises have been made to meet that budget price. The Oppo A5X has phenomenal battery life for a $219 phone, and it's matched with an excellent promise of future support that really does add a significant layer of value to the equation. The balance there is that it's not a fast phone, although it's within its scope for a phone at this price. It's not particularly nicely designed, though not exactly terrible, and its cameras are quite ordinary, which is unusual for Oppo given its general camera phone reputation. I would argue that the Oppo A5X gets the balance very right for most phone buyers, because a phone with a flat battery is just a brick, and it takes quite a long time for the Oppo A5X to get there. Combine that with a very long support cycle for such an inexpensive phone, and I reckon you've got a budget winner here. Anyway, that's my take on the Oppo A5X. Got any thoughts? Hit me up in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching.